There is a sequence of 11 seconds in the black box recording from the Cassia Verde that I have watched 437 times. I know the number precisely because my access log is preserved in the Directorate archive, timestamped, and the file's playback counter was never reset during the investigation. 437 viewings across the 11 months between the attack and the departure of the Iron Penance. I did not watch it compulsively. I did not watch it out of grief, though grief was present. I watched it because it was my job, and because jobs of this kind require that you understand exactly what you are responding to before you authorize what the response will cost. I will describe what the recording shows. Not because you need to be moved by it, though you will be, but because the Cassia Verde is the reason. She is the entire reason. Every decision that followed, every warship commissioned and crewed, every targeting solution computed and filed, every Vethrani city that now exists only as a spectral outline in a subterranean survey map, all of it begins in those 11 seconds. If you want to understand the Iron Penance, you begin there. The Cassia Verde was a hospital ship, registry ECS MH77 Warren, operating under the medical protections codified in the Corvin Accords. She was 440 meters from bow to stern, painted white, Red Cross of Earth's Medical Service rendered in oxidized brass plaque on her port and starboard flanks at frames 90 and 220 plaques. Nearly 4 meters across, visible to both 50,000 kilometers in clear space with standard optic magnification. Hull identification number was stenciled in black on her dorsal spine in letter ing 2 meters high. She was lit. She was broadcasting her medical service transponder on every channel the Corvin Accords specified, plus 2 supplemental channels she had added as a precaution. When the Vethrani Sovereignty began maneuvering in the Keseth Corridor 3 weeks prior, Captain had filed a precautionary position report with the Orvane Station Authority before departure, noting the increased Vethrani activity and requesting that his position updates be logged at 2-hour intervals instead of the standard 6. That request is in the record. His diligence is in the record. She was not a warship. She carried no weapons. She carried 200 patients. Soldiers recovering from wounds sustained in the Keseth perimeter skirmishes. Civilians transferred from the colony at Tethys Station after a Vethrani border incursion had destroyed that station's medical facility, and she carried 340 medical staff, surgeons, nurses, recovery technicians, anesthesiologists, trauma specialists, the administrative staff who managed patient records and transfer logistics, and the ship's crew of 2,620 human beings. She was in transit from the forward staging base at Orvane to the primary care facility at Callaway Station, 12-hour passage through neutral corridor space that her route documentation showed had been transited by medical vessels 11 times in the preceding 8 months without incident. She was not in a combat zone. She was not close to a combat zone. She was in certified neutral corridor space, her transponders active, her hull lit, her plaques visible, her captain's position reports current. The Vethrani Sovereignty fired on her at 0417 station time. Not a stray shot, not a navigational error or a targeting miscalculation later disavowed. The Vethrani Sovereignty fired on her 3 times in sequence, from 3 ships operating in coordinated formation, a firing solution that could only have been computed against a positively identified target. Technical analysis conducted by the Joint Investigative Team established beyond any reasonable dispute that the firing solution used on the Cassia Verde required a target lock maintained for a minimum of 40 seconds per salvo, 40 seconds in which any qualified weapons officer in the Vethrani Naval Service was looking at a white hull broadcasting 6 identification signals and could see, on standard optic magnification, brass plaques at frames 90 and 220. The first salvo struck her forward observation deck. The second struck her drive section. Third hit the surgical complex amidships. The Cassia Verde broke at frame 190. She did not explode, she fractured. The way a structural member fractures when the load exceeds its tolerance, cleanly and finally, both halves rotating slowly apart on their own momentum as their atmosphere vented into the neutral corridor space she had been transiting in good faith. The black box recording captures 11 seconds of the interior of the forward command deck in the moment before structural failure reaches it. The lights are still on. The emergency systems have not yet tripped to red. The deck is calm, in the way that working spaces are calm when the people in them have chosen to remain at their stations, despite understanding what is happening to the ship around them. There is a woman at the communications station in the upper left of the frame. Her name was Petty Officer, Second Class Alara Venn, and she is looking at her board with an expression of focused attention that I can only describe as professional. She is doing her job. She is doing her job in the 11 seconds before she is killed, in a way that tells me she understood what was happening and chose to keep working anyway. She does not scream. She does not look at the camera. She adjusts something on her board. I have had the footage analyzed by 3 separate technical teams, and no one can say with certainty what she adjusted because the feed cuts before she completes the motion. That is the 11 seconds. I am Marin Solis. At the time of the Cassia Verde attack, I held the rank of Senior Analyst, Threat Assessment Division, Office of Strategic Intelligence, Consolidated Forces. I was 39 years old. I had spent 14 years analyzing Vethrani military doctrine, fleet disposition, and political decision-making. I was not the first analyst assigned to the incident. The initial assessment was handled by a joint investigative team under Admiral Corus Vall. But I became the primary analyst when the investigation transitioned from incident assessment to response planning, a transition that occurred 61 days after the attack when the Vethrani Sovereignty released its formal position statement. The statement ran to approximately 900 words in translated form. I will not reproduce its substance in detail because doing so would consume time. Is better spent elsewhere. But the relevant section was a 2-paragraph sequence in the middle of the document that described the Cassia Verde as a vessel suspected of conducting intelligence operations under medical cover. The statement did not provide evidence. It did not name a specific intelligence function the Cassia Verde was alleged to have been performing. It applied the term suspected in the way governments sometimes apply that term, as a word that performs the grammatical work of accusation without accepting the legal burden of it. It stated that the Vethrani Sovereignty regretted the loss of life, but maintained that its vessels had acted within the parameters of reasonable defensive precaution, given the intelligence environment of the Kesith Corridor. The statement was released publicly. It was not transmitted to the Earth Consolidated Diplomatic Channel first. It was released publicly through the Vethrani Foreign Communications Bureau to the general intersystem news networks before anyone in the directorate had been formally notified that it existed. I want to emphasize this detail because it is not a procedural complaint. It is evidence. A government that has made a mistake or that recognizes its action crossed a line it did not intend to cross transmits privately before releasing publicly. It leaves a channel open. It performs at minimum the gesture of accountability even when it is not prepared to accept the full weight of it. Government that releases publicly without private transmission first is not making a gesture toward accountability. It is making a statement of position. The Vethrani Sovereignty was telling us, and telling everyone listening on the inter-system networks, that it had done what it did and would say so plainly to whoever asked. I read the statement twice and then I set it on my desk, and I looked at the wall of my office for a time that I could not afterward measure precisely. There was a window in that office that looked out over the North Bay of Callaway Station, and through that window you could see, when the angle was right and the light was correct, the mooring pylons of the station's medical wing. The Cassia Verde had been expected to dock. The pylons were empty. They would be empty for a long time. I did not feel rage. I want to be precise about this, because in the months that followed there were commentators who characterized the Earth Consolidated response as emotional, as a product of grief uncontrolled, of a government driven past its capacity for measured judgment. That characterization is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that matters. What I felt, reading the Vethrani statement, was something I can only describe accurately as the completion of a process, as if something that had been held in suspension, a question about what the Vethrani Sovereignty actually was, what it was capable of choosing, what constraints it recognized on its own behavior, had resolved into a final answer. The answer was not what anyone who had worked alongside me in the Keyseth monitoring program would have predicted 12 months earlier. It was clear. It was in its terrible way clarifying. Grief I had. Grief was there from the moment I received the first incident report and watched the recording for the first time in a secure room in the Directorate's third-floor assessment suite. Grief had been present for 61 days before the Vethrani statement arrived. What the statement did was not introduce grief. What the statement did was close the question of what to do with it. I wrote my assessment that afternoon. It ran to 63 pages. I will summarize it in 3 sentences. The Vethrani sovereignty had fired on a positively identified, clearly marked, operational medical vessel in neutral corridor space with no credible military justification. The subsequent public statement indicated that the sovereignty considered this action defensible and intended to offer no meaningful accountability for it. The continued operation of the Vethrani sovereignty as a functioning political entity therefore represented an ongoing security threat to any consolidated military medical operation in the region, which was to say any Earth-consolidated military personnel who required medical evacuation for the indefinite future. My recommendation, at the end of page 63, was total and disproportionate military response. I want to be careful about that word. Disproportionate, because it is sometimes used as though it were a criticism, and it was not intended as a criticism and should not be received as one. Proportionate response assumes that what you are responding to is a miscalculation, a lapse, a failure that a measured consequence might correct. Proportionate response is the vocabulary of diplomacy, of systems in which both parties maintain some baseline commitment to the proposition that calculations should be corrected rather than repeated. The Vethrani sovereignty's public statement demonstrated, clearly and for the record, that there had been no miscalculation. There had been a decision followed by a public defense of that decision. A decision followed by a public defense of that decision that was released without diplomatic forewarning to the general news networks as a statement of political position rather than a private communication offering explanation. When the entity across the table has indicated, clearly, and for the record, that it does not recognize the constraints you are operating under, proportionate response is not a vocabulary that applies. You are not correcting a miscalculation. You are responding to a declared position. The response I recommended was not designed to punish. It was designed to resolve. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Punishment is iterative, conditional, calibrated to behavior modification. Resolution is final. Resolution assumes that the entity you are responding to has demonstrated, by action and then by word, that behavior modification is not the available outcome, that the available outcomes are continuation of the threat or its termination. I had assessed the Vethrani sovereignty's behavior over 14 years of work, and I had read their position statement 3 times, and I concluded that the available outcomes were those 2. I chose the second and wrote 63 pages explaining why. Admiral Vall sat across from me for 3 hours the day I submitted the assessment. He is a man who came up through fleet operations, and who has a quality I have observed in very few officers: the capacity to be absolutely still. When he is thinking, he did not pace, he did not fidget. He read the 63 pages at the table while I sat across from him. He did not rush, sure. He read with the same quality of attention that he brought to every document I had ever put in front of him. A complete, deliberate, unhurried attention that I had learned over the years was not slowness but precision. When he finished, he asked me 2 questions. The first, whether I was confident in my characterization of the sovereignty's intent, as opposed to its action. I told him I was. He asked me to walk through my reasoning on the distinction between incompetent targeting and deliberate targeting, which I did, referencing the firing solution geometry, the transponder records, and the operational timing. 3 ships in coordinated formation do not fire in sequence by accident, do not select targets by accident, when the target is broadcasting 6 identification signals from a white hull in open space. Do not fire 3 salvos in sequence without an operator reviewing a target solution between each one. The second question was whether I believed a formal ultimatum delivered prior to response, produce a different outcome than the response itself. I told him I did not believe it would change the outcome, but that it should be delivered, regardless, on the grounds that the historical record should show we offered the choice. He agreed. He approved the assessment that afternoon and transmitted it to the Joint Command Council. The Council authorized the response 48 hours later. I was seconded to the response planning team on day 53. I did not request the secondment. Admiral Vall made the assignment and explained that he wanted someone on the planning team who had written 60 pages on why the response was necessary, on the grounds that such a person would be unlikely to authorize shortcuts that undermine the legitimacy of what was being undertaken. I took his meaning. There is a kind of response that becomes something other than justice, something that ceases to be defensible not because it is too large, but because it is careless, because it harms the wrong things for the wrong reasons, because it becomes an expression of fury rather than an answer. That was not what I had recommended. What I had recommended was specific, targeted, complete, and documented. My function on the planning team was to ensure those four qualities held for 9 months against every pressure, operational, budgetary, political, that would have eroded them. What was built over those 9 months was specific, targeted, complete, and documented. Callaway Station's dry dock complex occupies the station's inner ring, accessible through 3 pressurized transit corridors from the main administrative levels. I had been to the dry dock once before, years earlier, a facilities tour during a logistics assessment. It is a functional space, industrial, loud in the way that large fabrication environments are always loud, the constant movement of material and crew, creating a kind of ambient noise that you stop hearing after an hour and then suddenly hear again when it stops. What I had not experienced before the Iron Penance project was the dry dock at full wartime capacity. The scale of what was being built was not something I had fully conceptualized from the planning documents, despite having written portions of those documents myself. A warship blueprint is a bounded object. Dimensions, tonnage, armament specifications, complement, operational parameters. 340 such blueprints, stacked in a planning file, are still bounded. 340 warships being built simultaneously, in a dry dock complex that had never been designed for anything approaching that tonnage, is not bounded. It overflows its container. It becomes the primary reality of the station around it. To not be anywhere on the inner ring of Callaway Station during those 9 months, without the Iron Penance being the ambient fact of your existence, the vibration in the deck plates when a large hull section was being moved, the smell of composite welding compound that penetrated the air recyclers and reached 200 meters from the bays in every direction, shift schedule postings in the transit corridors, listing crew rotations for 12,000 dry dock workers, cycling through every 24 hours. When you walked the inspection corridors along the bay windows and looked at the hulls taking shape, the Anvil-class dreadnoughts first, their structural frameworks filling bays that had never held anything larger than a cruiser-weight resupply ship. There was a quality to the sight that was difficult to name accurately. It was not inspiring, exactly. It was comprehensive. It was the visual fact of a decision being executed without reduction. I made 26 inspection visits during the build period. My role was documentation and assessment. Verify that what was being built conformed to the response architecture in the original recommendation. That scope was not being reduced under operational or budgetary pressure, that nothing was being quietly omitted because someone in the logistics chain had decided the operation could be accomplished with a smaller force. Nothing was omitted. The Joint Command Council had made its decision and the Directorate executed it without reduction. I want that to be clearly stated, because there were political voices throughout the 9 months that argued for scaling back, for a more limited operation, for giving Vethrani sovereignty a second opportunity to seek accountability before the full response landed. I understood those arguments. I had written counter-analyses of every one of them. None of them changed the fundamental fact. The sovereignty had already been given the opportunity. The 61 days between the attack and the position statement were an opportunity, a window in which accountability could have been sought. And they had used that window to release a public statement defending what they had done. The question of whether they would accept accountability had been answered. There were voices that called what we were building disproportionate, excessive, a response that exceeded what the situation warranted. I found those voices difficult to answer patiently because my sense of what the situation warranted and their sense of what the situation warranted began from entirely different premises. Their premise was that a bad act by a foreign government should be answered with a commensurate bad consequence, calibrated carefully so as not to disturb the larger order. My premise was that the attack on the Casilla Verde was not simply a bad act by a foreign government. It was the declaration of a position that, if allowed to stand, meant that any hospital ship in neutral corridor space was a legitimate target for any government willing to attach the word suspected to a vessel's name. A position that, if allowed to stand, meant the Corvin Accords had no operational meaning, that they were a vocabulary of protection without a corresponding enforcement mechanism, a courtesy that could be extended or withdrawn at the discretion of whoever had more ships in a given corridor on a given day. The Iron Penance was not disproportionate to a bad act. The Iron Penance was what it cost to make the position that act represented impossible to maintain. On my 9th inspection visit, I was given a walkthrough of the command deck of the Dreadnought's settled account, the ship that would carry Admiral Vall and serve as the fleet's primary command node during the operation. The settled account was 3/4 complete at that point, her hull sealed, and her power systems running on internal generation, but her crew, stations still being fitted. I walked the command deck with the construction team's senior liaison, a civilian contractor named Ard Van Seth, who had been building warships for 30 years, and who had the quality of someone to whom very large, dangerous objects were simply the medium of his work, the way stone is the medium of a mason. He showed me the fleet command console, tactical display array, the communications suite, and the targeting confirmation station, where every strike order would be reviewed and logged. For execution, he did not ask me what the ship was for. He did not need to. Everyone on Callaway Station knew what the ship was for, in the same way that everyone knows what a very large fire is for when they see someone building it methodically on a cold and purposeful morning. I stood at the viewport of the settled accounts command deck for several minutes near the end of the walkthrough. The viewport looked aft across the dry dock bays, and from that angle you could see 7 other hulls in various stages of completion. 2 more knots, 3 cruisers, 2 destroyer hulls being assembled from sections on adjacent frames. It was late in the station's day cycle, and the work lights were running at full intensity across all the bays, and the effect of it, the scale of it, the white light on the hull plating, and the weld, seams, and the figures of 12,000 workers moving through it, was one of the few things, during those 9 months, that I could not immediately translate into analytical language. I stood at the viewport and I looked at it, and I did not translate it. I simply held it. The build proceeded on schedule and then ahead of schedule. The dry dock teams worked with a kind of focused energy that large, consequential projects produce when the people executing them understand what they are building and why. I do not mean they worked with anger or vengeance as a motivator. The dry dock crews were civilian contractors and station technicians, and they worked with the precision and discipline that professionalism demands, not with emotion. But there is a difference between a workforce that understands the weight of its work and one that does not. And the Callaway Station dry dock teams, during those 9 months, understood the weight of their work. The Casilla Verde had docked at Callaway Station regularly in the years before the attack. Many of the people building the Iron Penance had seen her at her mooring pylons. Some of them had known people who served aboard her. They built what they were contracted to build. They built it correctly, and they built it 4 days ahead of schedule. The Casilla Verde's sister ship, Tuna Pale, was moored in Bay 7 during the build period, undergoing routine resupply. She was 2 bays down from where the Fur Anvil-class dreadnought was taking shape, and I passed her on my 2nd inspection visit and stopped at the corridor window to look at her. She had the same white hull, the same brass plaques, the same identification stenciling. She was considerably smaller than the dreadnought beside her. The way a hospital ship is always smaller than a ship built for different purposes at different scale. I stood at that window for several minutes and thought about what it meant for the people who served on her. What it meant to maintain a medical ship, to keep its plaques polished, and its transponders active and its hull lit, with the knowledge that the Vithrani sovereignty had declared, publicly, and without apology, that those things were not protections, that the brass plaques and the identification signals and the certified neutral corridor, none of it had protected Ilara Ven or the 619 people aboard the Cassia Verde. The Iron Penance departed Callaway Station at 09 station time on a Tuesday. I was on the station observation deck when the fleet left. The observation deck is a civilian space. Transparent panels looking out over the departure corridor, a gallery built for events that people want to witness. It was not designed to watch a war fleet depart. There were perhaps 300 people on the deck when I arrived. Station personnel mostly, engineers and technicians from the dry dock teams, some administrative staff, a handful of civilian residents who had simply come to see. It was quiet in a way that observation decks are usually not quiet. Not the quiet of an empty space, but the quiet of a full space, where people have chosen not to fill the fullness with noise. 340 warships departed in sequence over 4 hours and 30 minutes. The largest were the Anvil-class dreadnoughts, 8 of them. And they moved with the particular quality of very large objects moving through space, which is a quality of mass rather than speed, the sense that what is moving is defined not by its velocity, but by its inevitability. I have tried to find another word for that quality, and I have not found one. Inevitable. They were inevitable in their movement. Behind them came the Reacher-class fleet carriers, 12 of them, each carrying a complement of strike fighters. Behind them the cruiser line, the destroyer screen, the support vessels, the command intelligence ships. The last vessel cleared the departure corridor at 13:30, 4 hours and 30 minutes after the first dreadnought moved. I stood at the panel for all of it. When the transit gate closed, I stayed at the panel for another 20 minutes, looking at the empty space where the fleet had been. 300 people on the observation deck had done the same. Then people began to drift away, in ones and twos, back to the work that continues while a fleet is gone. I was one of the last to leave. I was aboard the ISV Calculus, a command intelligence vessel, not a warship, a platform for analysis, coordination, and communication, for the transit and the operation. The Calculus was assigned to the fleet's rear echelon, which meant she was at the safest position relative to the engagement zone while remaining within real-time communication distance of fleet command aboard the settled account. I want to state this plainly because some subsequent accounts have described my role during the operation in terms that imply proximity to the fighting that I did not experience. I was not in the fighting. I was in the rear echelon, receiving operational data in real time and providing analysis and contextual assessment to Admiral Vall's command team. The people who were in the fighting were the crew of 3 Fridmorty warships, and they deserve the historical accuracy of that distinction. The transit took 16 days. The rhythms of it were the rhythms of a professional crew on a mission they understood completely, shift cycles and briefing schedules, and the specific quality of silence that settles over a ship when its purpose is known and accepted and no longer needs to be discussed aloud. The intelligence deck ran on 3 shifts, and I worked the primary day shift and kept to a schedule I had set for myself. On the first day out, work from the first hour of the shift to the last, eat in the mess with whoever was there, exercise for 40 minutes, sleep. The structure was deliberate. Structure is not distraction. Structure is what allows you to hold weight over time without it breaking you. The work during transit was preparation. Every targeting solution in the response architecture required a final update against current Vithrani, dispositions, fleet positions, defense platform status, command infrastructure location data, changes to military communications routing, since the planning files had been compiled. This work occupied most of my shift hours for the first 12 days. By day 13, I had updated and locked every primary target file and moved into review of the contingency packages. The alternative target sets that would be applied if Vethrani fleet dispositions on arrival differed substantially from the projected ones. By day 15, those packages were complete, and I had nothing left to do but wait and maintain readiness. On day 15, I walked the length of the calculus from her bow section to her engineering spaces and back. She is not a large ship, 180 meters, a fraction of the warship she was supporting, and the walk took perhaps 20 minutes each way. I passed the crew quarters and the communications suite and the small wardroom where the intelligence deck's senior staff took their meals, and I walked through the main data processing bay where the targeting computers ran the final crowd transit calculations. And I walked through the secondary communications room where 3 specialists were monitoring Vethrani broadcast channels in real time, and I came eventually to the ship's small forward observation space. A room with 3 viewport panels that faced forward and to each side, designed not for military observation but for navigation checks and during close-quarter maneuvering. It was unmanned in transit. I sat in the observation chair for 30 minutes and looked at the transit field, the faint luminescence of compressed space that surrounds a vessel at speed. And I thought about nothing in particular, which is a thing I rarely do, and which I think was the closest I came during the transit to something like rest. I reviewed the Cassia Verde recording twice during the transit. Once on the 3rd day out, to confirm a technical detail in the response documentation I was updating for the operational record. Once on the 14th day, the night before we crossed into Vethrani space, at my station in the flat overhead light of the intelligence deck, with the rest of the night shift running around me at reduced capacity. I watched Ilara Ven at her board for 11 seconds, and then I closed the file, and I sat for a while, and then I went back to my shift preparation for the following morning. We entered the Vethrani system at 06 fleet time on day 17. I was at my station when the system entry notifications came through the sensor feeds. The Vethrani defense grid registered our arrival within 4 minutes of transit completion. Their outer system sensor network was extensive and well maintained, which I had documented in assessments over the years, and which the planning team had fully accounted for. We were not attempting surprise. Surprise was not part of the design. The Iron Penance was designed to be seen. A fleet of 340 warships arriving in a system is not an instrument of stealth. It is an instrument of answer. The Vethrani Defense Network broadcast a challenge signal at 0607. The response had been composed, reviewed, approved by the Joint Command Council before departure. Admiral Val transmitted it at 0611. He said, "This is Admiral Chorus Val, commanding the Iron Penance Fleet, Earth Consolidated Forces. On the 14th day of the 7th month of the current year, vessels of the Vethrani Sovereignty fired on and destroyed the hospital ship Cassia Verde ECS MH77 a medical vessel operating under full Corvin Accord protections in certified neutral corridor space, killing 2,620 human beings. No military justification for this action exists." The Vethrani Sovereignty's subsequent public statement declined accountability and asserted a right to conduct such actions without consequence. Earth Consolidated Forces are here to dispute that assertion. Free. You have 90 minutes to transmit unconditional surrender of the Vethrani Sovereignty's military command authority and acknowledgement of full accountability for the attack on the Cassia Verde. If you transmit that surrender, the Iron Penance will stand down, and the accountability process will proceed under the jurisdiction of the Corvin Accord tribunal system. If you do not transmit that surrender in 90 minutes, the Iron Penance will proceed. That was the entirety of the transmission. No threats beyond the statement of intent. No ultimatum rhetoric beyond the offer and the deadline. It was transmitted on open channel, all frequencies including civilian broadcast, so that the record of it would exist in the Vethrani civilian communications archive as well as the military one. Whatever happened next, no one in that system could claim they had not been told what was being offered and what the alternative was. I monitored the challenge frequency throughout the 90 minutes. The intelligence deck was quiet in a different way during those 90 minutes than it had been during the transit. The transit quiet was a settled quiet, a resolved quiet. The 90 minutes had a different quality. It was not hope, exactly. It was the formal completion of the offer. We were completing the offer because the historical record required it, and because Admiral Val and I, and the Joint Command Council, all agreed that the record should show we gave the choice. We were not waiting for a different outcome than the one I had assessed in 63 pages. We were waiting because waiting was required. The 90 minutes passed. There was no surrender transmission. There was a Vethrani military response at minute 73. An outer system. Defense platform activated its weapon systems, which our sensor network registered immediately and logged. At minute 90, by Admiral Val's command, the Iron Penance proceeded. I will describe what happened in the Vethrani system over the next 41 hours from the vantage point of the intelligence deck of the calculus. As a sequence of information rather than a visual experience, because an intelligence deck does not have viewports, and the work done on it is work with data. This is the most honest way to describe it. It's because what happened in the Vethrani system over those 41 hours was not primarily a visual event. It was a computational event. It was the application of a precisely specified quantity of force to a precisely specified set of targets in a precisely specified sequence. It had been designed to be exactly that, and it was. The Vethrani outer defense platforms were engaged first. 16 platforms, distributed across the system's outer transit corridors. The same corridors through which the Cassia Verde had been moving when she was struck. Each platform was engaged by dedicated elements of the destroyer screen. This took 40 minutes, within the 30 to 60 minute range I had estimated. 40 minutes of methodical, sequenced work. The Vethrani military fleet, 208 vessels of various classes, was engaged by the Iron Penance's main body in the inner system. I will not narrate this in operational detail, but I will say what the engagement reports told me. The Vethrani fleet fought. They fought with the competence and determination of a force that understood what it was facing and chose engagement over withdrawal. This was consistent with 14 years of Vethrani doctrine analysis. Their military culture valued engagement over strategic retreat, visible throughout their doctrinal literature, consistent across 3 decades of operational records. And that culture held in the final engagement as it had held in every engagement before it. They were a pure war state. They were a capable, organized, determined military force. They matched us in most things that conventional military analysis measures. They fought us as peers, and they were defeated as peers. And I want to say that plainly, because the record should not suggest that what the Iron Penance defeated was something less than what it was. The Iron Penance lost 11 ships. I will state that without qualification, because it belongs in the honest record. 11 ships and the people aboard them. They are not a footnote. They are a consequence of the decision I recommended, a consequence I assessed and accounted for in the original 63 pages as a cost that the response would require. Acceptable cost is a phrase that sounds cold when you say it in the context of the people who paid it, and I will not defend the phrase by softening it. The cost was real. It was paid by real people who served aboard real ships, and I have read their names. And I will carry them, alongside the names I was already carrying, before the fleet departed. The Vethrani fleet was destroyed in total over 19 hours of engagement. What remained was the surface. The Iron Penance targeted the Vethrani sovereignty's military command infrastructure, its weapons manufacturing facilities, its naval yards, its orbital defense installations, its military communications network, its strategic fuel reserves, and the governmental apparatus of the sovereignty itself, its legislative and executive chambers, its intelligence facilities, its foreign policy institutions. It did not target civilian residential areas. It did not target civilian infrastructure, power generation, water treatment, agricultural systems, civilian transportation networks, beyond the incidental damage that proximity to legitimate military targets produces. That incidental damage was assessed and logged and was not used as a reason to expand the target set. I want to say something about how that targeting architecture was maintained over 41 hours, because it did not maintain itself. It was maintained by the weapons officers confirming target solutions before each strike, by Admiral Val's command authority exercised in real time from the settled account, and by the documentation I had built into the response architecture before departure. The requirement that every target confirmation be logged with its rationale. The requirement that any strike producing collateral damage above a specified threshold be flagged to Fleet Command before execution. These were not procedural bureaucracy. They were the structure of a response designed from the beginning to be defensible in the historical record. This is not a distinction that satisfies everyone. There are commentators who argue that any operation at the scale of the Iron Penance is, by definition, indiscriminate. I disagree, and I disagree on the grounds of the documented record rather than sentiment. The targeting architecture was specific. It was applied specifically. The results conformed to it. If the distinction between a military target and a civilian target is to mean anything at all, if the Corvin Accords are to mean anything at all, the Vethrani sovereignty violated when they fired on the Cassia Verde. Then the Iron Penance demonstrated that Earth consolidated forces respect that distinction even in a total response operation. We did not do to the Vethrani sovereignty's civilian population what the Vethrani sovereignty did to the 2,620 people on the Cassia Verde. That is not symmetry. That is a statement about what we are. The Vethrani sovereignty's governmental administration transmitted a formal request for ceasefire at hour 37. It was signed by 3 surviving members of the sovereignty's executive council. It acknowledged the attack on the Cassia Verde. It acknowledged the sovereignty's responsibility. It requested that the Iron Penance stand down and offered unconditional surrender of the sovereignty's remaining military command authority. I received it at hour 37 and 12 minutes and forwarded it to Admiral Vall within 20 seconds of receipt. His response was transmitted at hour 37 and 28 minutes. He said, "Shh." The window for unconditional surrender closed 90 minutes after our arrival in this system. The Iron Penance will complete its designated operation. Any remaining Vethrani military assets that stand down voluntarily and do not engage Iron Penance vessels will not be targeted. Civilian population areas are not and have not been targeted. The Iron Penance will complete its designated operation. I will not pretend that the 16 minutes between receiving that ceasefire request and receiving Admiral Vall's response was a neutral experience. I have read subsequent assessments that characterize me as someone who processed that exchange with professional detachment. Those characterizations are accurate about my conduct and inaccurate about my interior state. My interior state was not detached. It was not doubt. I did not doubt the decision, but it was not detached. It was the weight. The same weight I had been carrying since I looked at the empty mooring pylons on the day I read the Vethrani position statement. Receiving the ceasefire request was not an unexpected event. I had assessed it as likely, had noted in the original recommendation that any sufficiently damaged adversary would seek ceasefire before total defeat if the option existed. Request itself was not what produced the weight. What produced the weight was the convergence of everything that had led to it. The 90 minutes of offered choice and silence, the 19 hours of fleet engagement, and now, at hour 37, the executive council of the entity that had fired on the Cassia Verde asking us to stop in a transmission that acknowledged what they had done. They had not acknowledged it in the 90 minutes we gave them. They acknowledged it now. Admiral Vall's response was the answer that the decision, made 11 months earlier, had always been going to produce. The Iron Penance completed its designated operation. At hour 41 and 17 minutes, the Vethrani sovereignty, as a functioning political and military entity, ceased to exist. What that means precisely: the Vethrani sovereignty's civilian population, several hundred million people across the sovereignty's inhabited worlds and stations, was alive. Their homes were intact, their basic infrastructure largely intact, their capacity to feed and sustain themselves intact. What ceased to exist was the structure that had issued the order to fire on the Cassia Verde, had defended that order publicly, and had declined the 90 minutes of offered accountability. The military command was gone. The governmental authority was gone. The foreign policy apparatus that had released the public statement was gone. The people who had lived under that structure were not gone, and I want to be unambiguous about that. Because the record of what the Iron Penance was, requires that distinction to be unambiguous. What happens to those people is not a question the Iron Penance was designed to answer. It is a question for other people in other rooms in the years that follow, and I am not among those people. I have watched from the outside, in the years since, as the work of reconstruction and accountability has proceeded. I have read the summary reports of the Corvin Accord Tribunal process as they have been published, and I have followed the political development of the successor governance structures in the former sovereignty's territory. I have no comment on whether those processes have been sufficient or insufficient. That is genuinely not my area. My area was the 63 pages and what they produced, and that area is closed. I resigned my commission on the day of the fleet's return, and I have not re-entered the Office of Strategic Intelligence in the years since. My resignation letter I had written during the transit and given to Admiral Val in sealed form before we entered Vethrani space. My reasons were not what the subsequent commentary assumed. I did not resign out of protest or moral collapse, or the weight finally breaking me. I resigned because the work was done. The 63 pages I had written were the product of a particular analytical orientation brought to bear on a particular problem. And when that problem had been resolved and documented, and the fleet returned, that orientation had completed its function. The work that comes next, the reconstruction analysis, the accountability tribunal work, the long examination of what a region looks like in the absence of an entity that had occupied it for decades, requires a different orientation than I was not the right instrument for that work. I knew it, and Admiral Val knew it. And handing in my clearance card on the day of return was the correct conclusion to what I had started. On the afternoon, I wrote 63 pages and am on his desk. I have also, in the years since, been asked what I feel about the operation. This is a question I find harder to answer than the question about whether it was just, because what I feel is not a clean thing, and does not summarize cleanly. I feel the weight, which has not changed in any meaningful way. I feel what I can only describe as a completed obligation, not satisfaction, would be the wrong word, and would imply an emotional response to the destruction of a military political entity that I did not feel and do not feel, and would be concerned about feeling. I feel that the Cassia Verde and the 2,620 people aboard her were answered. Not avenged, answered. Matters. Vengeance is a transaction between grief and its object. What I recommended, and what the Iron Penance executed, was not a transaction between grief and its object. It was the application of a logical conclusion to a demonstrated premise. The Vethrani sovereignty demonstrated, by action and word, that it considered the Corvin Accord's medical protections optional. The logical conclusion of that position, extended to its endpoint, was a world in which any hospital ship in neutral corridor space was a potential target indefinitely, any government willing to attach the word suspected to a vessel's name and fire. The Iron Penance made that endpoint impossible to reach. That is what I recommended. That is what was done. I do not feel satisfied about it, because the Cassia Verde still broke at frame 190, and Ilara Ven still adjusted something on her board in the 11 centiseconds before the feed cut, and nothing that the Iron Penance did or could have done changes those two facts. The answered is not the same as the undone. I have lived with that distinction for every year since, and I expect to live with it for every year that remains. Reno walked from the docking bay to the North Bay Observation Gallery on the day we returned. The medical wing's mooring pylons were occupied, 2 supply ships and a tender ordinary vessels doing ordinary work. I stood at the panel and looked at them. The maintenance woman from departure day was there, buffing the transparent panels. She saw me come in. She looked at me with the look that people have when they understand, without being told, what you were part of, and what came back and what didn't. She did not say anything. I did not say anything. She went back to her panels. I stayed for an hour. Then I went to my office and cleared my desk and handed in my clearance card. The historical record of the Iron Penance operation is what it is. I have given testimony to 3 subsequent review bodies, and I have maintained the same position in each. The attack on the Cassia Verde was deliberate murder committed against a positively identified, clearly marked, protected medical vessel in neutral corridor space. The Vethrani sovereignty's response to that act demonstrated it recognized no accountability for, and intended to maintain the position, that such acts were within its acceptable operational parameters. And the Iron Penance was the correct response to an entity that had declared, by its actions and then its words, that it did not recognize the constraints that make coexistence possible. I have been asked in each of those testimonies whether I believe the operation was just. I believe it was necessary. I believe necessary and just are not always the same thing, and I believe the difference between them is where the weight lives. The weight that did not leave me during the 9 months of building, or the 16 days of transit, or the 41 hours of operation, or the 18 days home, or the years after that. I do not believe carrying that weight makes me good in a simple or comfortable sense. I believe it makes me a person who did the work they were responsible for doing, at the cost the work required, pretending the cost was less than it was. Every day since I have carried the names on both sides of that ledger. I will carry them as long as I carry anything. Laura Venn was at her board when the Cassia Verde was hit. She was doing her job. She adjusted something on her board in the 11 seconds before the feed cut, and no one has ever been able to tell me with certainty what she adjusted. She did not look at the camera. I watched her 437 times, and then I went to work, and then I did not stop. Neither did the Iron Penance.